Okay, this will be my first kind of video trying something like this. And I just kind of wanted to see if I'm in focus here. Okay, so what you are currently seeing is a Fujifilm X-H2S with the new 16 to 55 Mark II. I'm shooting at f2.8 with a Nisi full spectrum 6-stop Indy and f-log2c. I'm using the focus area here, just trying to get it on my face with gloves on. So we are in Wisconsin here. It is 16 degrees out today. I think this is the first time I've taken my camera out for prolonged use in this kind of temperature, so I guess see how everything holds up. But the purpose of today is I kind of wanted to talk about my camera journey, what cameras I've been using, the different sensor formats, and kind of all that, and where I'm kind of landing from the perspective of a wedding videographer. So I guess to start, I started shooting weddings back in 2018, and at the time I just focused kind of learning as much as I could from YouTube. And really at that time what I'd noticed was Sony was what people were recommending the most, and nothing's really changed since then. But at the time I really bought into it. But I guess kind of going back a little bit before then, the very first camera I bought was a Canon C200, and I'd planned to use that for commercial work, but it didn't end up working out. I ended up getting into weddings instead, and I had a Canon C200 and a Panasonic GH4, and I didn't really think that was a very good match. And at the time I was not really shooting that many weddings, so I couldn't afford to really buy another C200 to get an even match. So that's when I officially turned to YouTube regarding what would be the best cameras to get. And 2018, the A7 III was all the rage. Just get my gimbal back on me. And I ended up getting 2 of those and rocking with them for the remainder of that season, shooting weddings. And I would say I learned a lot. But for me, I just was not a fan of the 8-bit footage. And at the time, I kind of wanted more slow motion. So I kind of looked for something else. And what caught my attention was the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Now, I did love that camera, and it taught me a lot about color grading and all of the flexibility that B-RAW provides. But my biggest issue with that system was I could just not find a way to rig it up for my uses shooting weddings. So what I ended up doing was going back to the previous generation, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera OG, and then the Blackmagic Micro Cinema Camera. And I ended up using those for a wedding season. So with those I was restricted to 1080p only, but the latitude with those systems was incredible, and I probably would have actually shot with them for an additional season. But the issue was just getting reliable SD cards at the time, because I think right around then, that was 2019, and SanDisk was no longer making their good V30 SD cards. So it was actually getting pretty difficult to source high quality SD cards that would work with the DNG files that the Blackmagic cameras were making. So I ended up switching again, this time to the Fujifilm X-T3. And one of the main deciding factors there was that it could do 4K 60. And I thought the price was pretty decent, and is a much bigger sensor size, going from basically the equivalent of a 1-inch sensor to now Super 35 APS-C. And I stuck with them for another wedding season, so this was 2020, and didn't have a lot of weddings that year. And I did like the system. I even took on a couple of wedding photo jobs, but ultimately I guess I just watched too much YouTube again and really wanted the A7S III. And after watching a ton of videos on the A7S III, I also started to compare it to the Panasonic S1H, or the Lumix S1H. And after a ton of comparisons, I ended up going with a Lumix S1H and a Lumix S1 for my 2021 wedding season. And I have to admit that I did love those cameras as well. The IBIS was great, the footage was great, I mean everything out of it was great except the autofocus, which is really what kind of made me regret not going with the A7S III originally. So 2022 rolls around and I finally decide that this will be the year of Sony, and they just released the FX3. So I bought 2 FX3s, and before the wedding season had even started, A7 IV came out, so I picked up one of those as well. And I rocked the season with those cameras, and I would say the autofocus is definitely everything that it's cracked up to be. It was phenomenal. And I personally found myself not really manually focusing at all. And I think for me, I got so used to the autofocus taking control that I let the camera make almost all of the focus decisions. And I mean, for those that have used Sony and know how the tap to track works, I would use that a lot. And that's kind of how I would use the Sony system outside of, just kind of letting it work its magic. But in the end, I just thought that it took too much control away from me. And only being able to shoot in 16:9 also, I felt, limited me creatively. So I ended up switching one more time, and this time I ended up going back to Panasonic, but this time it was the Micro Four Thirds system, and the GH6 had just been released, and it was definitely a downgrade in terms of autofocus, but the freedom that the IBIS system provided me in that system with the GH6 was incredible. And low light, I think, had definitely improved compared to what people used to say about Micro Four Thirds, and I really did enjoy that system. But once again, it came down to the lensing was my main issue, and I bought primarily the Olympus Pro lenses, which they have about a focus throw of, I think, about 90 degrees to 120 degrees. So like the Olympus 45 millimeter and the 40 to 150 millimeter, when they're both at their longest telephoto reach and at their highest aperture, there's just no way that you can reliably manually focus those those lenses. And it just really frustrated me because the autofocus on the GH6 was just not good enough. And with these lenses in the Olympus system, even though they're compatible with Panasonic, there's no linear focus control like there is on the Panasonic lenses. So I was pretty much either had to rely upon autofocus or that very short 90 degree or 120 degree on the lens, or I would just have to go focus by wire. So even though I really did enjoy Micro Four Thirds, I just did not like the lenses I ended up with. And that was the majority of the investment in the system. So I got rid of that system. And then I went to something unique, I guess I would say. Excuse me. And that is the Sigma FP. And I'd actually bought one of them a couple years prior, but I only used it for like a month and then sold it off because I could just not find a way to get it to work for me. But I'd seen at the time a lot of YouTubers, once again, kind of showed me how great the footage of this camera looked. And there was this small Chinese company, Dark Power Labs, making modifications for the camera that would actually make it usable in a more kind of run and gun wedding situation. So I ended up going from Micro Four Thirds back to full frame in Sigma FP, and I went fully manual. I ended up going with a set of mostly prime Canon FD lenses. I had a couple of zooms. I think it was just the 100 to 300. I had two of those zooms, and that was pretty much my coverage. And I loved shooting with those cameras as well. I mean, I tested the crap out of them for probably 4 months, shooting with them nonstop, making sure they'd be able to hold up the job, because that camera is extremely quirky. I would say I don't own it anymore. Big surprise there. But otherwise, I mean, from as much use as I got out of it for that year, that'd be a whole entire different video. But regardless, the reason why I ended up getting rid of that camera was also because of the lenses, where the Canon FDs are incredible lenses and they work very well with the Sigma digital sensor, but having no autofocus doesn't bother me so much when I'm behind the camera. But I typically shoot wedding solo, and the Sigma FP, while it's recording, does not have punch in the focus. And even with a monitor, just like when it's sunny out, it was just hard to know whether I was in focus. And there would be so many weddings where I would come back and the entire ceremony would just be ever so slightly out of focus on like one angle. And it would be rare that that wouldn't happen. And I just kind of started to get frustrated. And it's like, I don't like autofocus all the time, but when I'm not on the camera, just being able to at least push it and like just do like single check autofocus just for a moment, just to make sure everything's good. And the other big issue with the Sigma FP is, for people that don't know, is to get the best image quality out of it, you have to shoot in RAW. And the only way you get RAW is through Cinema DNG. You can either get it in 1080p or in 4K. Shooting 4K 24p like Cinema DNG is only going to get you like about an hour a terabyte. So 4K was pretty much out of the question. So I would just end up shooting 1080p and have gimbal get me again. There we go. Having 1080p wasn't a problem. I mean, I think the footage was so malleable that 1080p was not an issue for me. It was mostly just the lenses, and I didn't have any more native L-mount lenses at this time, so I don't know if the Sigma FP's autofocus would have been good enough to continue doing what I needed it to do. But in the end, I gave up on it just because I just needed autofocus for certain moments, and going completely not autofocus worked with the Blackmagic because it was such a small sensor, but being full frame, you really have so little leeway that I just couldn't make it work for me. So I resold all the gear again, and the Sigma FP is not a very popular camera. The Canon FD lenses are ancient at this point, and I mean, they are still popular, but I got mostly like the f2.8 primes, and I mean, they're fairly common. I only paid a couple $100 for each, so reselling them all, I mean, I almost made my money back, but yeah, I didn't make much back. So kind of just working off of the budget that reselling the gear gave me, I decided to try something completely different and go on the payment plans for my next camera system. And that was the Canon C series. Back again. They were my very first camera, and I thought maybe they'd be my last cameras that I'd be sticking with. So I picked up two R5Cs and a C70. And I do have to admit that when it comes to the menu system, the very first time when I owned the C200 as my first professional camera, I had no idea what I was doing. So that was not a good idea on my part. But now that I've been shooting for several years, I was amazed by just how great the Canon C-series menus are, where you can be recording and access every feature of the menu, pretty much change every setting. It was incredible, because shooting with hybrids, your hybrid mirrorless cameras, typically as soon as you start recording, you either can't change any settings at all, which is typical mostly of Fujifilm, when you can change a few settings, but you're limited. And most other cameras, you can't even access the menu once you start recording. So that was actually truly a breath of fresh air with the Canon C series, and that you could make any changes you want. And being like an event live shooter, being like an event shooter, it's came in really handy. So from there, I used those on several events, but not a wedding, and I really did love those cameras as well. I shot a commercial project, and all in all, I loved them. But when it came up to the wedding season, I started to panic, and that they don't have IBIS. They only have digital stabilization, both the C70 and R5C. And I have not used a gimbal in several years, and I was really afraid of spending probably almost $2,000 on getting like a gimbal all rigged up, because last time I used a gimbal was with my FX3, and I really hated using a gimbal even back then, so I didn't want to go back to that. And I thought about it long and hard, and even though I love the image quality and the menus and just all the flexibility that the C series provided, I ended up going back all in on stabilization, back to the GH series. And what kind of motivated me to do that was the release of the G9 II, which finally Lumix had phase detect autofocus and a all-around decent camera. I say decent in that It is micro four thirds, and pretty much the standard these days is full frame, but we can talk about that a little bit more. So I'm dropping back from full frame to micro four thirds, and this is my second time on micro four thirds. And this time I decided no Olympus lenses. Let's just go all Panasonic, all native, all the newest generation, so they all have the linear focus control. And that's what I did. I ended up getting a G9 II, a GH6, a GH5S, and finally the GH7 when it came out. And the GH6, I think, was probably the worst camera out of the bunch, even though, excuse me, I loved it the first time around. I did not like it the second time around. I honestly, through all the weddings I shot, I felt like when I left the GH6 alone, unmanned, it had the most autofocus hiccups, even more so than the GH5S. Maybe that was the settings I had it on, maybe that was my fault, but it failed me the most in that regards. And also, for those that don't know, the GH6 has a base ISO and vlog, their log profile of 2000 ISO. Panasonic fixed that with the G9 II and GH7 and gave it a base ISO 500. So now being 2 stops below. It really was quite difficult to use in that terms. So I really started to not like the GH6. But the G9 II, GH7 were great, and Panasonic even further upgraded their stabilization system by having an active stabilization that was mostly like removing a gimbal entirely. It's not on the same level as a gimbal, but it's very, very close. And that feature I made use of pretty much the entire wedding season last year. So I started the video saying I'm on a Fujifilm X-H2S. So how'd we get here then? Towards the end of the year, I started wanting for more subject separation. And in terms of the micro four thirds system, the only f1.2 lens that Panasonic makes is the 42.5 millimeter f1.2, which is an 85 millimeter equivalent, which makes it really only usable for like static portrait shots. I mean, you can't really move around that much with that tight of a focal length. So then I opted for manual focus lenses, like the Sirui Nightwalkers. The problem is, though, is with the 2x crop factor, I think the widest lens they ended up making was 16, which ended up being 32. And I used that for almost all of my nighttime dance reception, just manually focusing kind of in the dark, and it worked really well. It's just my issue was that was like the only lens I could use, because nothing else was really fast enough, or I would just have to stick with, other manual focus lenses, which isn't that big of a deal. It's just that what it ultimately came down to is I wanted more subject separation with autofocus for the times I needed it, like just, tracking people, or just for romantics and posing. And pretty much what it ended up coming down to was my most used lens is the Panasonic Leica 10-25. Now it is a bright f1.7, but the problem is even at 25 millimeters, which would be like an equivalent of a 50 millimeter at f3.4, I just was not getting the separation that I would have liked. And the 25 to 50, I could get the separation I wanted. I mean, it would almost look like a full frame lens, but then I'm stuck at 50 to 100 millimeters, and that's just not something that works for me when it comes to group shots or prep in the morning. So, I mean, the system now is great with the GH7, the G9 II, but what kind of started to irritate me is Sirui released the Sniper series, but it didn't come out for Micro Four Thirds. And there's been a lot of new Chinese lens manufacturers skipping Micro Four Thirds entirely, or only releasing the widest angle lens. And my fear is that Micro Four Thirds, although it's finally what I would say good now, I think it's peaked in a sense that there's really not much more development. And if Olympus and Panasonic both, or just say Olympus, if they allowed their lenses, all their pro lenses, to act just like Panasonic native glass, the system would be amazing. I would have no complaints then. But since Olympus lenses do not function like native Panasonic lenses, even though they share the same mount, they're both first-party lens developers, just of different systems, or just of different camera bodies, I'm left wanting for faster glass. And as a professional, I mean, yes, I made a pretty hefty investment in the Micro Four Thirds, and it's frustrating that I'm moving again, but ultimately I just wanted more than what I could get out of that system. And I could have continued using it, I mean, perfectly fine. None of my couples complained about a lack of super shallow depth of field. So I mean, I guess it's just me not being satisfied with the equipment I have, or just always wanting something new. Maybe that's it too. Regardless, I ended up selling all the Panasonic equipment and buying a Fuji X-H2S. And I really do enjoy the camera. The autofocus, I'll have to see how it's done on this video. I'm kind of moving around, not paying a ton of attention to framing because I'm holding this gimbal and it's kind of an exercise, and I'm looking all over the place, kind of everywhere except at the lens, so sorry about that. But now I'm on Fuji again. I've got the 23mm and 33mm Sirui sniper lenses. They're both f1.2, which is amazing. Like, the shallow depth of field I get with those lenses is, I'm completely satisfied with. I don't think I would need anything more than that. And the autofocus is pretty good. I have not used them on a professional job yet, so when put under stress, I'm not sure how they would perform. I did take them on a vacation to Disney World, and I think they held up decent. A setting I just changed was I had the X-H2S on normal mode, and I just learned about boost mode improving, I guess, autofocus performance. Excuse me. So I turned that on just yesterday, and this is my first time properly using it, so excuse me again. See if that made any difference. And I guess kind of to sum it up is, for my uses, I really want a camera that's at least Super 35. Micro Four Thirds is definitely usable. I use it for a whole wedding season, and it's very freeing just being able to get a shot pretty much everywhere and just being able to pretty much lock the sensor with its IBIS and get really steady shots, like non-moving, almost tripod-like shots. That was very useful. The problem is there was also lots of times where I probably should have used a gimbal to get more steady shots, like panning across like details. The IBIS was still too jerky to get really good movement there. So I guess it's always kind of a trade-off of convenience versus using the best equipment to get the best results. But going back to what I was saying, for me, I think going forward, Super 35 is going to be the minimum for me. And I feel more creatively inspired when I have more options than just 16:9 or 17:9, which is why Panasonic and Fujifilm have always been so attractive and why I've come back to them on multiple occasions. They both offer open gate, and I just like having options like that. And I'm speaking about that because currently Sony does nothing like that. Even in their cinema line, a la the FX6, only having 16:9 or 17:9 with a slight crop of 1.1 times. I mean, that's not a bad thing. You can do completely fine work just shooting 16:9. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Rotate it vertically, you got 9:16, perfect for social media. So no issues there. You can do it. And tons of people do. And having great, reliable autofocus, so you only have to worry about framing, you don't have to worry about maintaining focus, grabbing focus. You can shoot at extremely shallow depths of field, something you would never be able to do without autofocus. They're great for that. And that's kind of where the dilemma comes in that if the Fujifilm X-H2S had perfect autofocus, I think I'd be a little bit happier. But I'd also really like internal NDs in a slightly larger body. That's one thing I do have to say about the GH7, is for having a small sensor, its body size felt really great in the hands. Its body was even bigger than the X-H2S, which holds a larger sensor. So I guess there's just trade-offs everywhere. And that's honestly the main reason why I'm hesitant to drift back to Sony, even though I would love to have their autofocus again. But I'm pretty much fully invested in the CF Express Type B right now. I have over 6 cards. They're great. They offload so fast. You pretty much have unlimited options of recording codecs. I mean, nothing right now that's out there is going to be able to saturate the data rates of these cards. But I guess I'm always looking still for that perfect camera for me, which I think most people have kind of understood that it's the right tool for the right job, and no one camera can do it all. But I think an issue that me and a lot of other people struggle with is we don't want multiple lens systems. And I know we can adapt, and maybe EF lenses would do a good enough job. Here we go. But then the problem is I don't want to really be investing in outdated lenses, or not necessarily outdated lenses, but lenses that I build my system around these EF glass. And there's no way, because if they get discontinued, there's no way to replace them, get repair parts. And I mean, right now I'm still seeing new prices be just like what they were when RF lenses started coming out. So maybe the used market is a little bit cheaper. But one lens I was really interested in was the final version of the EF 35mm f1.4. As far as I could see, that lens is still like $1,400 brand new, which is pretty much what the newest RF version of it costs. So I didn't see really the value in going to EF yet, or ever, I guess. Because I guess I just want the best chance of having the best autofocus performance, and using a mirrorless camera, I think it's going to be with a mirrorless lens. But I don't want multiple lens systems. So I guess the struggle persists of, right now, I only have this one camera. Typically when I sell off systems, I buy 2 or 3 bodies of roughly the equivalent same kind of type. Easier for matching multi-cam shoots. This is the first time I haven't done that. Not because I'm not confident in what Fujifilm is capable of. I think it would get the job done, and I think I'd be very happy with it. The reason I haven't is because I'm not confident enough that I will want to stick with just one body, one lens system. Even though I say I don't want it, I don't want to split between 2 systems. Ultimately, that may be the best route to go, and that's what I'm still currently debating. And having the C70 before, I did enjoy that camera. I thought the build quality was pretty poor. I mean, having the R5C, which is cheaper than the C70, but then to hold the C70 and feel like it is much significantly lower build quality than the R5C kind of frustrates you, in that all the money, I guess, is going into the sensor, and the build quality is really just a way to cut costs, which was frustrating. And I only had the C70 for probably 6 to 8 months, and thankfully nothing broke on it, but that was a serious fear, and as a professional piece of equipment, you don't want that kind of risk. Your gear's just going to break, even though, you know, at the time before the C80 came out, it's $5,500, so it's not an insignificant investment. But now that the C80's out, it is interesting, but it still uses SD cards. And I believe the argument that most other people have made, that it's a cost savings measure and also a way to delineate between the C400 and the C80. But once again, it's frustrating nonetheless, because I really do not want to go back to using SD cards, which is the main reason I'm still torn about whether I should get a C80, because it offers so much of what I want, except the media I'm really not interested in. So then there's the C400, but honestly, with that, I would get the media I want, and the data rates are stronger. So I mean, the image quality would most likely be superior in the raw 6K. But if you're shooting 24p, the 4K in long GOP and below would be equivalent. And at this point in my career, I only shoot weddings in 24p. Pretty much shoot everything in just 24p. I only do slow motion for fun when I'm like filming my kids or just doing little stuff. Nothing professional anymore when it comes to slow motion. So I mean, maybe the C80 could still work for me. And I don't want this to just become a video about me thinking about getting the C80, because I'm still torn in that the FX6 could be that great tool that you know, it maybe is not something that inspires me artistically, but at least it would be a tool that could reliably get the job done. But I guess my fear at this point is with the camera going on several years old. I mean, we know the next firmware update's coming in 2026, so it at least won't be out of date yet. It's got, I would assume, another year, maybe 2 years of use. But I shot on the FX3 for a wedding season, and with this being pretty much the same sensor, just different processing, I didn't like having ISO 800 and ISO 12800, which is why the C80 is so appealing, having a triple base ISO. And I'm not sure how much noise reduction the C80 applies in those ISOs. I've looked at CineD's database. They have not done a proper lab test to really explain their findings yet, but just kind of guessing based on the results they published, how different the raw data is. Like, I think the raw numbers are like 3 stops below the XF ABC numbers. When I'm saying numbers, I mean, what do I mean? Dynamic stops to dynamic range. Sorry. So when it comes to there being a 3-stop disparity between XF ABC and Canon raw light in terms of stops of dynamic range, it makes you wonder that how much noise reduction are they actually applying to the footage? Because that's also something I ran into with the FX3. Shooting that at night, I shot ProRes RAW. In the ProRes RAW, you could really see how noisy that 12,800 ISO really was. And so really, you could say, sure, the Sony FX3 sensor, A7S3 sensor, FX6 sensor are good in low light, but it's, I think a lot of it just comes down to bumping the ISO, and it's just noise reduction that makes it tolerable. But it's like, I shot a scene on a beach at nighttime, and I cranked my ISO up to like 102,000, which, yeah, it's not for professional work, it's just for fun, because why would you do that? But when I got the footage back, there was so much noise reduction already applied, the image was so blocky, there was really just not enough data to recover with noise reduction, because it had already been noise reduced so much. And that's kind of just my fear of going back to Sony, because when it comes to professional, their professional equipment, that sensor is kind of de facto what Sony has chosen for the industry, and people have picked it up in droves. But having used it, it's not really my favorite. And we can use lights, and I do use lights, but when it comes to open dancing, or I mean certain scenes where if they want to run outside at nighttime, I can maybe bring a small little LED mounted on my camera. And I guess my fear is just working with an image that's already had noise reduction applied. That's what I like about the Fujifilm camera so much, the X-H2S specifically, is I've already tested the low light performance, and it's pretty much just lumen noise. It's just white noise, and DaVinci Resolve can remove that so simply. And at least on my M2 Max Studio, it really doesn't place even that much of a burden on it like it would if I had to do like luma and chroma noise reduction. So it really makes shooting in low light with the Fujifilm X-H2S a nicer experience, I think, than shooting with the Sony FX3. And with these f1.2 lenses, granted you can get f1.2 on Sony as well, but having f1.2 with these lenses, and I also bought the 50mm Fujifilm f1.0 lens, which is going to be like a 75mm equivalent. So I'm not sure how great that's going to be on the dance floor, but it's their fastest autofocus lens, so I thought I'd give it a shot this year. At least pull it out, maybe try it a few times. But it's only January, my first wedding isn't until May, so I guess I have several months to kind of decide what I want to do. I think I've mostly laid it all out here where there's so many good cameras, but I just want to stick with one camera lens ecosystem. I'd like it to be mirrorless. And at this point in time, there's really no one system that completely speaks to me. If Canon opened up RF and they had all these amazing options from like Viltrox now, Theory with, granted, they're starting to get full frame lenses now instead of just Super 35. If we had all of these extra options, which, I mean, when I had the Canon, I had the Trinity, I had the 15 to 35 f2.8, I had the 24 to 70 f2.8. I only ended up with the 70 to 200 f4 because I heard rumors of a Z version coming, so I didn't invest in that one. But I had all those lenses, and they were amazing. They were incredible, and there's really no complaints there. But they're very expensive, which I guess helps with the resale value. But the investment is a little hard to stomach these days when you have so many great lenses, and you're really stuck with no options if you go Canon. And they really are making it very enticing with the bodies, the camera bodies they've released this year. Granted, it's only the cinema line that I'm interested in, so not the R1 or R5 Mark II, but having the C80 and the C400, they do give you options. I really just wish the C80 didn't just have SD cards, but now I'm just kind of rambling back on that one point. So I guess kind of to sum it all up, this is already being a pretty long video here. I don't think sensor size matters that much. It really all comes down to field of view, where the bigger the sensor, the wider field of view you can achieve. And with it being wider, you can get closer to your subject and get a shallower depth of field. So I guess it's the right tool for the job. And I guess I could honestly see myself using a Micro Four Thirds, a Super 35, and full frame camera. And in a perfect world, say Sony bought Panasonic or something, and then they had all those tiers, and they made like an E-mount Micro Four Thirds camera that you could actually use one lens on every single format. I think that'd be the way to go. But I just don't want to use CF Express A cards, and I would like more than just 16:9 to shoot in. But I guess that's where I'm at so far. This is my first time actually vlogging. Been holding this camera setup and Ronin RSC2 gimbal for 50 minutes now. And I've only been recording, so sorry. Yeah. Oh yeah, and then I'm also trying timecode for the first time with this camera too. I'm using the Tentacle system. Have the Tentacle Mark I plugged into the camera, just on the audio port, because Fujifilm has not given us a, what would you say, more adaptable version of timecode. They've only used strictly vendor specific timecode options at this point. I think it's been Adamus with their Sync Blue, and then Ambient just came out back in November with the latest firmware update. But those are the only two ways you can actually embed timecode metadata into the clips. This way I'm just getting audio, and I'll have to try and convert it in DaVinci Resolve. But then I also have the Tentacle Sync Track E that I'm recording to installed into my jacket. Kind of have it right below the Columbia logo installed down there. Just the gimbal handle's kind of in the way. So I'm not sure how that's going to sound. Hopefully this whole little monologue is going to end up being usable. But we shall see when I get back inside. Just been walking around my local park doing 6 or so laps. That's why there's a couple times where it's just getting a little short of breath. But yeah, I think that's all I've really got for today. I feel like I can ramble about this stuff forever. Yeah, I guess I will leave it at that for now. Take care.